The desert sun burned hot over the small trading post near the Mexican border in 1882. Dust devils danced across the barren landscape, while vultures circled overhead, waiting for something to die in the merciless heat. Jack Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he loaded supplies onto his wagon. He had been trading with various tribes for 3 years now, but something felt different today. Morrison was a rough man in his 30s with weathered skin and cold blue eyes. He came west after the Civil War, looking to make quick money from anyone willing to trade. His reputation among the Apache was already shaky. Several tribal elders had warned their people about the white trader who cheated on weights and watered down his whiskey. But Morrison didn't care about their complaints. He saw the Apache as nothing more than obstacles to his profit. The trading post sat at the edge of Apache territory, run by an old Mexican man named Carlos, who tried to keep peace between all parties. Carlos had warned Morrison many times about showing respect to the Apache people, especially their women. But Morrison laughed off these warnings, believing his rifle and the few soldiers at the nearby fort would protect him from any trouble. On this particular morning, a small group of Apache arrived at the trading post. They rode their horses with the grace of people born in the saddle, their dark eyes scanning everything around them. Among them was a young woman named Ayana, whose name meant eternal blossom in their language. She was the daughter of a respected war chief and known throughout the tribe for her wisdom and healing abilities. Ayana wore traditional Apache clothing, including a beautifully crafted shirt decorated with intricate beadwork that had been passed down through generations of women in her family. The shirt was not just clothing but a sacred item that represented her family's honor and her connection to her ancestors. Every bead had been placed with love and prayers by her grandmother and mother. The Apache group had come to trade deer hides and handmade pottery for metal tools and fabric. They conducted their business quietly and respectfully, as was their custom. Morrison watched them from behind his counter, his eyes lingering on Ayana in a way that made Carlos uncomfortable. The old Mexican man had seen that look before, and it never led to anything good. As the trading continued, Morrison became increasingly bold in his stares and comments. He made crude remarks about Ayana's appearance, not caring that she understood enough English to know what he was saying. Her male companions grew tense, their hands moving closer to their weapons. In Apache culture, disrespecting a woman, especially one from a chief's family, was one of the worst insults possible. Carlos tried to distract Morrison by showing him some silver jewelry that had just arrived from Mexico City, but Morrison pushed the old man aside, his attention fixed entirely on Ayana. The other Apache in the group positioned themselves protectively around her, recognizing the dangerous gleam in the white man's eyes. The situation escalated when Morrison decided he wanted a closer look at Ayana's beadwork. Without permission or warning, he reached across the counter and grabbed her shirt. Ayana stepped back quickly, but Morrison's grip was strong. The sacred garment stretched and pulled as she tried to free herself from his grasp. What happened next would be remembered by both cultures for generations. Morrison, frustrated by Ayana's resistance and emboldened by what he saw as his superior position, yanked hard on her shirt. The ancient fabric, weakened by years of careful wear, tore with a sound that seemed to echo across the desert. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the trading post froze as they realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. Ayana stood there, holding the torn pieces of her grandmother's sacred shirt, her face a mask of controlled fury and deep humiliation. The beads that had taken months to sew scattered across the wooden floor like tears. The Apache warriors with her reached for their weapons, but Ayana stopped them with a single gesture. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute authority. She spoke in Apache to her companions, her words measured and deliberate. Though Morrison couldn't understand the language, he could feel the power in her voice and the way it made everyone around him step back. Carlos, who understood some Apache, went pale as he heard her words. She was not just expressing anger about the torn shirt. She was making a formal declaration that would carry far beyond this small trading post. In Apache culture, When a woman of her standing was dishonored in such a way, it became a matter that involved the entire tribe. Morrison, still not understanding the gravity of his actions, laughed nervously and offered to pay for the damaged shirt. He pulled out some coins and threw them on the counter, as if money could repair what he had torn. The sound of the coins hitting the wood seemed to break the spell of silence that had fallen over everyone. Ayanna looked at the scattered coins with contempt. She spoke again in Apache, this time her voice carrying across the desert air like a war cry. The warriors with her straightened their shoulders and nodded grimly. They understood that this was no longer about trade or damaged clothing. This had become a matter of tribal honor that would require a response. Without another word, the Apache gathered their remaining trade goods and prepared to leave. But before mounting her horse, Ayanna turned back to face Morrison directly. Her dark eyes met his blue ones, and in that moment, he finally began to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. She didn't need to speak English for him to read the promise in her expression. As the Apache rode away from the trading post, Carlos shook his head sadly. He had lived on the frontier long enough to know that Morrison had just signed his own death warrant. The old Mexican man began gathering his most precious possessions, knowing that the trading post would likely be abandoned or destroyed within days. Morrison watched the Apache disappear into the heat shimmer of the desert, still not fully grasping what his moment of disrespect had set in motion. He went back to organizing his supplies, occasionally glancing at the scattered beads on the floor. By evening, word of the incident would reach Ayanna's father and the tribal council. By morning, Morrison would understand exactly what it meant to dishonor an Apache woman. The Apache riders moved swiftly through the desert landscape as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Ayanna rode in the center of the group, her torn shirt carefully wrapped and held close to her chest. The sacred garment would be shown to the tribal elders as evidence of the disrespect she had suffered. Every hoofbeat carried them closer to a reckoning that Morrison could never imagine. Chief Nalnish sat outside his lodge as the evening stars appeared, sharing stories. With his grandsons around a small fire, he was a man in his 50s. His hair streaked with gray, but his body still strong from decades of leading his people through countless battles and negotiations. His weathered face bore scars from conflicts with Mexican soldiers and American cavalry, but his eyes remained sharp and intelligent. The sound of approaching horses made him look up from the fire. Even in the dim light, he recognized his daughter's silhouette among the riders. But something was wrong with the way she held herself, the way the others rode protectively around her. As they drew closer, Nalnish stood slowly, his warrior instincts telling him that trouble had followed them home. Ayanna dismounted and walked directly to her father, carrying the wrapped remains of her grandmother's shirt. The other riders remained mounted, their faces grim in the firelight. Without speaking, she unwrapped the torn garment and held it up for her father to see. The sacred beadwork, once so perfect and meaningful, now hung in damaged strips. The chief's face remained calm, but those who knew him well could see the fury building behind his dark eyes. In Apache culture, a woman's clothing was not just fabric and decoration. It carried the prayers and protection of her ancestors, the love of the women who had created it, and the honor of her family line. To damage such a garment deliberately was to attack everything the Apache people held sacred. Ayanna spoke quietly in their language, telling her father exactly what had happened at the trading post. She described Morrison's crude comments, his unwelcome advances, and the moment when he had grabbed and torn her shirt. She told him about the white man's laughter and his insulting offer to pay for the damage with coins, as if her family's honor could be bought. As she spoke, other members of the tribe began to gather around the fire. Word spread quickly through the camp that something serious had occurred. Warriors emerged from their lodges, their wives and children following behind. The elderly council members, both men and women, took their places in the circle. This was no longer a family matter, but a tribal one. Chief Nalnish listened to every word his daughter spoke without interruption. When she finished, he carefully took the torn shirt and examined it in the firelight. His fingers traced the broken beadwork that his own mother had created years before Ayanna was born. Each damaged section represented not just destroyed art, but violated memory. The chief's brother, Goyakla, stepped forward from the crowd. He was known among the Apache as a fierce warrior who had never shown mercy to enemies who disrespected their people. His voice was hard as flint when he spoke, demanding immediate action against the white traitor. Several young warriors voiced their agreement, their hands already reaching for weapons. But Nalnish raised his hand for silence. Though his anger burned like the desert sun, he was also a wise leader who understood that hasty actions could bring disaster upon his entire people. The American military had been pushing deeper into Apache territory every year, and any attack on a white man could be used as an excuse for a larger war. The tribal council spent the night in discussion, weighing honor against survival. The elder, women spoke of the sacred nature of what had been violated. They reminded everyone that Ayana was not just any woman, but a daughter of the chief, a healer who had saved many lives, and a keeper of their traditional ways. To let such an insult pass would encourage other whites to believe Apache women could be abused without consequence. The elder men spoke of practical matters. They discussed the soldiers at the nearby fort, the weapons the Americans possessed, and the safety of their children and elderly. But they also spoke of their duty as warriors to protect their women and maintain their honor. A people who would not defend their own dignity would soon have nothing left worth defending. As dawn approached, Nalnish made his decision. The insult to his daughter could not be ignored, but neither could the safety of his people. There would be a response, but it would be measured and purposeful. Morrison would learn what it meant to dishonor an Apache woman, but the lesson would not bring the entire American army down upon their heads. The chief called for his best scouts and warriors to gather before him. He selected 20 of his most trusted men, each known for their skill in battle and their loyalty to the tribe. These were not young hotheads seeking glory, but experienced fighters who understood the difference between justice and revenge. Nalnish spoke to his chosen warriors in the language of their ancestors, his words carrying the weight of tradition and the authority of leadership. He told them that Morrison must face consequences for his actions, but those consequences must be precise and meaningful. The white man needed to understand Apache justice, not simply Apache anger. The plan that emerged from the council meeting was both simple and sophisticated. The warriors would ride to the trading post not to start a war but to deliver a message. Morrison would be given a chance to understand the magnitude of his offense and make proper amends. If he refused or showed further disrespect, then Apache justice would be swift and final. As the sun rose over the desert, 20 Apache warriors began preparing for their journey. They painted their faces with traditional war colors and checked their weapons carefully. Their horses were the best in the tribe, selected for speed and endurance. But most importantly, they carried with them the righteousness of their cause and the backing of their entire people. Ayana watched the preparations. From outside her lodge, the torn shirt still clutched in her hands. Her father approached her as the warriors mounted their horses, his face stern but his eyes filled with paternal love and concern. He placed his hands on her shoulders and spoke words of comfort and strength. The daughter of Chief Nalnish had done nothing wrong, he reminded her. She had conducted herself with dignity and honor throughout the terrible incident. The shame belonged entirely to the white man who had violated both her person and their sacred traditions. Justice would be served, and her honor would be restored. As the 20 warriors rode out of the camp toward the rising sun, every member of the tribe understood that events had been set in motion that could not be easily stopped. Morrison had torn more than just a piece of clothing at the trading post. He had ripped a hole in the careful balance that existed between two very different worlds, and now both sides would have to deal with the consequences. Jack Morrison woke up on the morning after the incident with a splitting headache and no memory of how much whiskey he had consumed the night before. The empty bottles scattered around his small room behind the trading post told part of the story, but his mind was too foggy to piece together why he had felt the need to drink so heavily. Sunlight streamed through the dirty window, making his eyes water as he struggled to sit up on his narrow cot. Carlos had left the trading post before dawn, taking only what he could carry on his old mule. The Mexican man had tried one last time to warn Morrison about the seriousness of what had happened, but the traitor had just laughed and reached for another bottle. Carlos knew there was nothing more he could do except pray for Morrison's soul and get as far away as possible before the Apache returned. Morrison stumbled outside to the well behind the trading post, splashing cold water on his face and trying to shake off the effects of too much alcohol. The desert morning was crisp and clear, with a slight breeze carrying the scent of sage and creosote bush. He noticed that Carlos was nowhere to be seen, but assumed the old man was probably sleeping late or had gone to tend his small garden behind the building. As Morrison went about his morning routine, he remained completely unaware of the forces gathering against him. 20 Apache warriors were already hours into their journey toward the trading post, their horses eating up the miles with steady determination. Each warrior carried weapons that had been blessed by the tribal medicine man and sharpened to deadly perfection. The trading post sat in a small valley surrounded by low hills covered with desert scrub. It was a good location for business, as travelers could see it from miles away, but it was also isolated and defenseless. The nearest military fort was a day's hard ride to the east, and the small town of San Carlos was even further away. Morrison had chosen this location precisely because it was far from outside interference, but now that isolation would work against him. Around mid-morning, Morrison began to notice that something felt different about the day. The usual sounds of desert life seemed muted, and even the ever-present buzz of insects had faded to an unusual quiet. He attributed this to his hangover, and continued organizing his inventory, counting bottles of whiskey and checking his supply of ammunition and tobacco. The first sign that trouble was approaching came from his horse, a nervous mare named Betsy, who had served him well during his years of frontier trading. The animal began pacing restlessly in the small corral beside the trading post, her ears constantly swiveling and her nostrils flaring as she tested the air for unfamiliar scents. Morrison noticed her behavior, but dismissed it as typical horse skittishness. By noon, the Apache warriors had reached the hills overlooking the trading post. They dismounted and left their horses with 2 of their number while the other 18 crept forward on foot to observe their target. From their elevated high position, they could see Morrison moving around the building, apparently unaware of any danger. The warriors noted that Carlos was nowhere to be seen, and that Morrison appeared to be alone. The war party leader was a veteran fighter named Cochise, named after the famous Apache chief, but younger and perhaps even more fierce. He had fought against Mexican troops, American cavalry, and rival tribes, earning respect through his courage and tactical skill. More importantly for this mission, he was Ayana's cousin and had been present when she was born, making the insult to her a personal matter. Cochise studied the layout of the trading post through the afternoon heat, noting every possible approach and escape route. The building itself was solidly constructed of adobe and wood, with thick walls that would stop most bullets, but it had large windows for displaying merchandise, and the door was built for welcoming customers rather than withstanding attack. Most importantly, there was only one man to defend it. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Morrison finally began to sense that something was wrong. The unnatural quiet continued, and even Betsy had stopped her pacing to stand, motionless in the corral, as if she were listening for something beyond human hearing. Morrison walked to the front door of his trading post and looked out across the desert landscape, shading his eyes against the glare. The valley appeared empty and peaceful, with heat waves rising from the desert floor and nothing moving except a few distant buzzards circling lazily in the thermals. But Morrison had lived on the frontier long enough to develop some instincts for danger, and those instincts were now screaming warnings that he couldn't ignore. He went back inside and checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. As evening approached, Cochise gathered his warriors for a final discussion of their plan. They would not attack like raiders seeking plunder or revenge. Instead, they would announce their presence and give Morrison one chance to understand what he had done and make appropriate amends. If he showed proper respect and remorse, they might accept compensation and return to their people with honor satisfied. But if Morrison showed the same arrogance and disrespect he had displayed toward Ayana, then Apache justice would be swift and final. The warriors understood that they were not just seeking satisfaction for one woman's humiliation, but defending the honor of their entire people. Every Apache woman deserved to know that her dignity would be protected by the courage of Apache. And as darkness fell over the desert, Morrison lit the oil lamps inside his trading post and tried to calm his increasingly frayed nerves. He had opened a new bottle of whiskey but found that alcohol no longer helped with the growing sense of dread that seemed to press down on him like a physical weight. Something was coming for him, and deep in his heart, he knew it had to do with what had happened the day before. The torn shirt and scattered beads from Ayana's garment still lay on the floor where they had fallen. Morrison had been meaning to sweep them up all day but had somehow never gotten around to the task. Now, in the flickering lamplight, the broken beadwork seemed to glitter with an almost supernatural intensity, as if the spirit of the violated garment was crying out for justice. Outside in the darkness, 18 Apache warriors began their silent approach to the trading post. They moved like shadows across the desert floor, their moccasined feet making no sound on the rocky ground. Each warrior knew his role in what was to come, and each was prepared to die if necessary to restore their people's honor. Morrison sat at his counter, rifle across his knees, trying to convince himself that his fears were groundless. But as midnight approached, he began to hear sounds that made his blood run cold. Somewhere in the darkness beyond his lamplight, he could swear he heard the soft footfalls of men moving with deadly purpose. The reckoning he had unknowingly called down upon himself was finally at hand. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the desert floor as Jack Morrison sat hunched over his counter, rifle still clutched in his trembling hands. He had not slept a single minute during the long night, jumping at every sound and shadow that seemed to move beyond his windows. His eyes were red and strained from staring into the darkness, searching for threats that seemed to dance just beyond the edge of his vision. Morrison had consumed nearly half a bottle of whiskey during his sleepless vigil, but the alcohol had done nothing to calm his nerves or dull his growing sense of impending doom. If anything, the liquor had made his imagination more vivid and his fears more intense. Every creak of the wooden building, every whisper of wind through the desert scrub, sounded like Apache warriors preparing to attack. As the sky began to lighten from black to deep purple, Morrison finally allowed himself to believe that his fears had been groundless. Perhaps Carlos had been wrong about the seriousness of the incident with the Apache woman. Perhaps the torn shirt was just damaged clothing, nothing more significant than a business dispute over merchandise. He began to relax slightly, his grip on the rifle loosening as exhaustion started to overcome his anxiety. But the Apache warriors had not spent the night preparing for a dawn attack. Instead, they had used the darkness to position themselves in a perfect circle around the trading post, each man hidden behind rocks, brush, or small rises in the ground. They were invisible to Morrison's eyes, but could see every movement he made through the windows of his building. They had watched him pace and drink and jump at shadows, understanding that fear was already doing part of their work for them. Cochise lay motionless behind a large boulder less than 50 yards from the front door of the trading post. He had been in this position for hours without moving, his trained body accustomed to the discomfort and his mind focused entirely on the mission ahead. Through a gap in the rocks, he could see Morrison clearly, noting the man's obvious exhaustion and the way his hands shook when he reached for his whiskey bottle. The war party leader felt no satisfaction at Morrison's obvious distress. This was not about causing fear or suffering, but about delivering justice and restoring honor. The white man would be given every opportunity to understand his offense and make proper amends. Only if he refused would the Apache warriors resort to violence, and even then it would be swift and decisive rather than cruel or prolonged. As the sun climbed higher, Morrison began to feel foolish about his night of terror. The trading post was surrounded by empty desert, with nothing more threatening than lizards and jackrabbits moving among the rocks and scrub brush. He set his rifle aside and walked to the front door, opening it to let fresh air circulate through the stuffy interior of his building. The morning breeze felt cool against his face, carrying the familiar scents of sage and desert flowers. A few clouds drifted across the blue sky, promising another hot day but also offering occasional patches of shade. Morrison took several deep breaths and tried to convince himself that his fears had been nothing more than the product of too much alcohol and an overactive imagination. But as he turned to go back inside, movement on the hills surrounding his trading post caught his eye. At first, he thought it might be animals or perhaps travelers passing through the area. Then he realized that the movement was too organized, too purposeful to be accidental. Dark figures were rising from concealment all around him, and he could see the glint of metal weapons in the morning sunlight. Morrison's heart began pounding so hard, he could hear it in his ears as the full scope of his situation became clear. Apache warriors were emerging from hiding positions in every direction, their faces painted for war, and their weapons ready for battle. They had completely surrounded his trading post during the night, and there was no possibility of escape. Cochise was the first to show himself fully, rising from behind his boulder with fluid grace and walking slowly toward the trading post. His rifle was held across his chest in a non-threatening position, but Morrison could see other warriors behind him with arrows notched and ready to fly. The message was clear. This could be resolved peacefully, but only if Morrison cooperated, completely. The Apache war leader stopped about 20 yards from the front door of the trading post and spoke in clear, careful English. His voice was calm and controlled, showing neither anger nor fear. He explained that they had come because of what Morrison had done to Ayana, the daughter of Chief Nalnish. The white man had dishonored an Apache woman, and such actions could not be ignored by her people. Morrison's mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. He vaguely remembered the incident with the torn shirt, but in his whiskey-soaked memory, it seemed like nothing more than a minor accident during a business transaction. Surely these warriors were not ready to kill him over a piece of damaged clothing. There had to be some misunderstanding that could be resolved through negotiation. Cochise continued speaking, his words measured and precise. He explained Apache law regarding the treatment of women, especially women from important families. He described the sacred nature of the clothing that Morrison had damaged, and the deep insult that his actions had caused. The white man was being given this one opportunity to acknowledge his wrongdoing and make appropriate compensation. The Apache leader gestured toward several warriors who stepped forward carrying bundles of trade goods. They had brought fine pottery, beautifully crafted weapons, and precious turquoise jewelry. This was not tribute or ransom, but an offering that would allow Morrison to restore the honor he had damaged. All he had to do was accept responsibility for his actions and show proper respect for Apache customs. Morrison stared at the offered goods and felt a surge of his old arrogance returning. These were just Indians, after all, trying to intimidate him with their primitive customs and superstitions. He was a white man, a civilized person who should not have to bow down to savage demands. The torn shirt was an accident, and he had already offered to pay for the damage. What more could they reasonably expect? The trader's face hardened as he looked at Cochise and the surrounding warriors. Instead of showing remorse or accepting the offered compensation, Morrison began to speak in the same crude and dismissive tone he had used at the trading post. He told the Apache that he owed them nothing, that their customs meant nothing to him, and that they should leave his property immediately before he called for help from the military. The change in the warriors was immediate and visible, where, before they had stood ready but relaxed, they now shifted into positions of imminent attack. Arrows were drawn back to full tension, rifles were raised to shoulders, and war clubs were hefted in strong hands. Morrison had just made the worst possible response to their offer of peaceful resolution. Cochise's face remained impassive, but his eyes grew cold as winter stone. He spoke once more in English, his words carrying the finality of a death sentence. The white man had been given every chance to act with honor, and he had chosen arrogance instead. Apache justice would now take its course, swift and certain as the desert wind. Morrison finally understood that his life hung by the thinnest of threads, and that thread was about to be cut by his own stubborn pride and cultural blindness. He reached for his rifle. But 18 Apache warriors were already in motion, their weapons trained on every part of his body. The reckoning had arrived, and there would be no escape from the consequences of dishonoring an Apache woman. The silence that followed Morrison's defiant words stretched across the desert like a taut bowstring ready to snap. 18 Apache warriors stood motionless around the trading post, their weapons aimed at the white man who had just sealed his own fate. The morning sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, casting sharp shadows that seemed to divide the world into areas of blazing light and absolute darkness. Morrison's hand froze halfway to his rifle as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his alcohol-clouded mind. These were not the half-starved reservation Indians he had heard about in town. These were warriors in their prime, men who had been fighting and surviving in this harsh desert for their entire lives. His single rifle against 18 trained fighters was not a battle but a form of elaborate suicide. Cochise raised his hand in a signal that every warrior understood. They did not move toward Morrison, but their circle tightened imperceptibly, like a noose slowly drawing closed. Apache leader's face remained calm, but his voice carried the weight of absolute authority when he spoke again. This was Morrison's final chance to reconsider his position before Apache justice became unavoidable. The white trader looked around the circle of painted faces and gleaming weapons, finally beginning to grasp the magnitude of what he had brought upon himself. These men had not ridden here for plunder or random violence. They had come with a specific purpose, following laws and customs that were older than any white settlement in the territory. His treatment of Ayanna had violated something sacred, and now payment was being demanded. For a moment, Morrison's resolve wavered. The trade goods that Cochise had offered still lay on the ground between them, beautiful examples of Apache craftsmanship that represented wealth and respect. All he had to do was acknowledge his wrongdoing, accept the offered exchange, and this nightmare would end. His pride warred with his survival instinct as seconds ticked by like hours. But Morrison was a product of his time and culture, a man who had been taught from childhood that Indians were inferior beings whose customs and feelings were irrelevant. Even facing death, he could not bring himself to show respect for what he saw as primitive superstitions. His jaw tightened with stubborn determination as he made his choice, choosing familiar prejudice over unfamiliar survival. Morrison straightened his shoulders and spoke in a loud voice that carried across the desert air. He declared that he was an American citizen who would not be intimidated by savages. He claimed that the torn shirt was worthless and that he owed nothing to people he considered barely human. His words were calculated to show maximum disrespect and contempt for everything the Apache held sacred. The effect of Morrison's speech was immediate and final. Cochise lowered his raised hand in a gesture that released his warriors from all restraint. The careful discipline that had held them in check vanished like morning mist, replaced by the righteous fury of men whose deepest values had been deliberately insulted. The time for words and negotiation was over. What happened next was not a battle but an execution, carried out with the precision and efficiency that only comes from years of warfare. Apache arrows flew from multiple directions simultaneously, each one finding its target with deadly accuracy. Morrison's rifle never made it to his shoulder, as the first arrow struck him in the chest, followed immediately by several more that ended his life before he could even cry out. The trading post itself received similar treatment as warriors methodically destroyed everything that represented Morrison's presence in their territory. Shelves were torn down, bottles were smashed, and trade goods were scattered across the floor. But this was not mindless destruction. The Apache carefully preserved anything of value that could be returned to their people, taking only what was rightfully theirs as compensation for the insult they had suffered. Among the scattered debris on the trading post floor, one warrior found the torn pieces of Ayanna's sacred shirt and the scattered beads that had been left where they fell. He gathered these carefully, treating them with the reverence they deserved. These fragments would be returned to Chief Nalnish and his daughter, allowing them to decide how the sacred garment might be restored or properly honored. As the sun reached its zenith, the Apache warriors completed their work and prepared to return to their people. They had not come as raiders seeking wealth or glory, but as instruments of justice carrying out their people's law. Morrison's death was not celebrated as a victory, but accepted as a necessary consequence of his own choices and actions. Cochise took one final look at the destroyed trading post, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret about what had transpired. Justice had been served according to Apache law, and the honor of their people had been restored. The white man had been given every opportunity to resolve the matter peacefully, but he had chosen confrontation instead. The responsibility for the outcome rested entirely on his own shoulders. The war party mounted their horses and rode away from the trading post without looking back. They left Morrison's body where it had fallen, knowing that eventually someone would come looking for the missing trader. The desert would tell its own story about what had happened, and those who understood the ways of the Apache would know why justice had been required. As they rode across the sun-baked landscape toward home, the warriors carried with them the knowledge that they had upheld one of their people's most fundamental principles. Apache women were sacred, deserving of respect and protection from all men, regardless of their race or culture. Anyone who violated that principle, whether white, Mexican, or Apache, would face the same swift and certain justice. The destroyed trading post stood as a monument to the consequences of cultural arrogance and disrespect. In the years that followed, other white traders would hear the story and learn to approach Apache people with greater caution and respect. Some would dismiss the tale as savage violence, but others would understand it as an example of a proud people defending their most cherished values. By evening, the Apache warriors were within sight of their home camp, where Chief Nalnish waited, with his daughter to hear the outcome of their mission. Smoke from cooking fires rose into the darkening sky, and children played among the lodges while their mothers prepared the evening meal. Life in the Apache camp continued as it had for countless generations, protected by the courage of warriors who understood that some things were worth dying for. The torn shirt that had started this chain of events would be carefully examined by the tribal elders and medicine men. They would determine whether the sacred garment could be repaired or whether it should be ceremonially buried with honor befitting its importance. Either way, the violation had been answered, and Apache justice had prevailed once again. The Apache warriors returned to their camp as the desert sky turned from gold to deep purple, their horses weary from the long journey, but their mission accomplished. Chief Nalnish stood waiting outside his lodge, his weathered face revealing nothing of the anxiety he had felt throughout the day. Behind him, Ayana sat quietly beside the fire, the torn pieces of her grandmother's shirt still cradled in her lap like a wounded bird. Cochise dismounted and approached the chief with the slow, measured steps of a man carrying heavy news. His hands were the scattered beads that had been carefully gathered from the trading post floor, each tiny piece representing not just damaged artwork, but violated honor. The other warriors remained mounted, their faces painted with the solemnity of men who had done what was necessary, but took no joy in death. Without words, Cochise placed the recovered beads at Chief Nalnish's feet and spoke in the ancient language of their people. He told of Morrison's final moments, how the white man had been given every opportunity to show respect and make amends. He described the trader's arrogant refusal to acknowledge his wrongdoing and his deliberate insults to Apache, customs and dignity. Justice had been served according to their law, swift and certain as summer lightning. Ayana looked up from her damaged shirt as Cochise finished his report, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames of the fire. She had not asked for Morrison's death, only for her honor to be restored and her people's dignity to be respected. But she understood that the white man's choices had made violence inevitable. He had been given a path to redemption and had chosen defiance instead. Chief Nalnish nodded slowly as he absorbed the news of Morrison's fate. As a leader, he felt the weight of every decision that led to bloodshed, even when that bloodshed was justified by law and custom. The trader's death would likely bring unwanted attention from American authorities, but allowing the insult to go unanswered would have been far worse for his people's future. The tribal council gathered around the fire as word of the warriors. Return spread throughout the camp. Elder women who remembered when such incidents were common nodded approvingly at the news. Younger mothers looked at their own daughters and felt reassured that Apache men would still protect their women's honor against any threat. The message sent by Morrison's death would resonate far beyond this single incident. Old grandmother Nietzsche, the oldest woman in the tribe and keeper of many sacred traditions, shuffled forward to examine the recovered beads and torn fabric. Her gnarled fingers traced the broken patterns with reverent care, feeling for the spiritual essence that still remained in the damaged garment. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the authority of 8 decades of wisdom and experience. The grandmother declared that the shirt could not be repaired in the traditional sense, as too much of its sacred essence had been violated by Morrison's disrespectful handling, but the remaining pieces could be transformed into something new, something that would commemorate both the violation and the justice that followed. The torn fabric would become part of a war shirt for Koshise, honoring his role in restoring tribal honor. As the council discussed the spiritual implications of what had occurred, scouts brought news that added urgency to their deliberations. A cavalry patrol had been seen moving toward the abandoned trading post, probably investigating Morrison's absence. The soldiers would find evidence of Apache involvement and would likely demand explanations or retribution from tribal leaders. Chief Nalnish listened to the scout reports with growing concern. He had expected this development but hoped for more time to prepare his people for the consequences. The American military had been looking for excuses to expand their control over Apache territory, and Morrison's death might provide exactly the justification they needed for a larger campaign against his people. The chief called for an immediate council of war, bringing together his most experienced warriors and wisest advisors to plan for the difficult days ahead. They discussed possible responses to American demands, potential refugees in the mountains, and alliances with other Apache bands who might face similar pressure. The death of one arrogant traitor had set in motion events that could affect their entire people. Ayanna stood and addressed the council with quiet dignity, her voice carrying clearly in the desert night. She spoke of her gratitude to the warriors who had restored her honor, but also of her concern for the consequences their actions might bring. She offered to surrender herself to American authorities if it would prevent broader conflict, showing the same courage her male relatives displayed in battle. Chief Nalnish immediately rejected his daughter's offer, as did every warrior present. Apache law had been followed correctly, and no member of their tribe would be sacrificed to appease foreign authorities who did not understand or respect their customs. If the Americans wanted war over this incident, then war they would have, but it would be fought on Apache terms in Apache territory. The discussion continued through the night, as the council weighed their options and prepared for multiple contingencies. Messengers were dispatched to other Apache bands, warning them of potential military action and requesting support if war became unavoidable. Weapons were checked and supplies were gathered for a possible retreat into the mountains, where cavalry horses could not easily follow. As dawn approached, the tribal medicine man performed a ceremony to honor the spirits of all who had been affected by recent events. He burned sage and sang ancient songs, asking for guidance and protection for his people in the trials that lay ahead. The smoke from his sacred fire rose straight up in the still morning air, carrying their prayers toward the home of their ancestors. Ayanna participated in the ceremony with her torn shirt clutched against her chest, feeling the weight of responsibility for everything that had followed from Morrison's attack on her dignity. But the medicine man assured her that she bore no blame for the white man's choices or their consequences. She had conducted herself with honor throughout the ordeal, and her people's response had been both necessary and justified. As the sun rose over the desert landscape, the Apache camp buzzed with purposeful activity. Children were instructed in emergency procedures while their mothers prepared travel supplies and medical provisions. Warriors checked their weapons and horses while scouts maintained watch for approaching soldiers. Everyone understood that their old way of life might be ending, but they were determined to face whatever came with dignity and courage. The story of Morrison's death and the torn shirt that caused it would be remembered for generations, told around campfires as an example of how Apache justice worked and why their customs demanded respect. Future generations would learn that honor was worth fighting for, that women deserved protection, and that some insults could only be answered with blood. In the years that followed, as the Apache people faced increasing pressure from American expansion, they would draw strength from stories like this one. They would remember that their ancestors had never bowed to foreign arrogance, never allowed their sacred traditions to be mocked or violated. The spirit that led 18 warriors to surround a trading post in defense of one woman's honor would sustain them through the darkest chapters of their history. The torn shirt had been transformed from a symbol of violation into a symbol of justice, its damaged threads woven into the larger tapestry of Apache resistance and survival. Morrison's grave in the desert would be forgotten, but the story of why he died would live on as long as Apache people remembered the importance of defending what they held most sacred.